Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. If you're not familiar with the Wilson Center, we were created in 1968 as a memorial by Congress as a memorial for our 28th president. And my project is one of 20 plus at the Wilson Center that convenes government, NGO, business, and researchers together to have nonpartisan discussions on hard topics. And today we have a very hard topic today that we're talking about is about plastic waste. Now our title is the Climate Footprint of Plastics, Search for Solutions in Asia, Europe, and the United States. This meeting is part of what's almost a 2-year series of meetings and research called Turning the Tide on Plastic Waste in Asia, supported by the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, and I'm working with the Institute of Developing Economies in Japan on it as well. Really excited for the speakers that I've brought together today to have this conversation about climate and plastics. I mean, a lot of times we think of plastic waste as simply the litter and the leakage into the ocean, but it's so much more. And today the speakers are going to help us understand the large and growing climate footprint of plastics, and how it is actually threatening our ability to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. So they're going to delve into kind of the market changes, the policies, the lawsuits, and civil society action that is out there to try to rein in both the demand and supply of virgin plastic resin and plastic packaging. We're going to start off with Carol Muffett, who heads up the Center for International Environmental Law. He's going to help give us kind of the foundation to understand, well, what does it mean when we say, what are the hidden climate footprint of plastics? How does it work? And so he'll give us the good foundation. Then he's going to toss the virtual mic across the pond to Alice Ma, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. And she's going to share some pretty fascinating research that she did in China on the Yangtze River Basin, on the environmental and social impacts of the petrochemical industry there, making the resin, obviously. And then she's going to fling that virtual mic even further over to Manila with Juan Hernandez, who is the global coordinator for Break Free from Plastic. And he's going to highlight some of the climate plastic nexus issues in Asia and talk about a lot of the different kinds of activism in Asia that's trying to also to decrease the demand and watchdog the producers to decrease it. And then last, it returns back to the UK for Rosa Pritchard, who is a plastic lawyer at Client Earth. And she's going to report on her organization's work pushing for new laws that limit unnecessary single-use plastics and a lot of the legal cases that they're bringing in Europe that are also trying to limit the production and use of plastic and integrating climate footprint in that. So I'm keeping it short in my intro. Hopefully it was short enough. Carol, I'd like to ask you to step forward to the virtual mic, share your PowerPoint, and tell some stories. But I want to point out to the audience that underneath the streaming screen that you're looking at, there is a Q&A widget. You can start now and submit questions. Speakers are going to talk for about 10 minutes each. So we're going to have a good half hour at the end. Send them difficult questions. They're a smart crew. All right, Carol, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. Can you quickly confirm that you can see my presentation?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. In Portland, Gregory, Texas, ExxonMobil and Saudi Arabia's basic industrial chemicals companies are building one of the largest ethylene crackers in the world. I say one of the largest because they keep getting bigger and we keep seeing more of them. Shell Chemical is building a massive petrochemical facility in Pennsylvania that is part of a growing and envisioned petrochemical and plastics hub in the US Northeast. And this is a phenomenon that we're seeing not only in the United States, but in the Middle East, in Europe, and across Asia, and indeed around the world. And at the heart of that phenomenon is a handful of companies whose names will be readily recognized: ExxonMobil, Shell, Total, Chevron, Sinopec. Why? Because 99% of plastics are derived from fossil fuel feedstocks: oil, coal, and primarily natural gas. In the US, we have seen that the fracking boom drove a massive build out of new plastics facilities because fracking made natural gas really, really cheap. The result was a race to build new plastics and petrochemical facilities. By 2025, the American Chemistry Council projects that the industry will have invested more than $200 billion in more than 333 new or expanded facilities. These buildouts threaten to lock in a massive expansion of cheap plastic production for decades, but they have another and less widely recognized impact. First, plastics and petrochemical production are set to become the largest driver of oil demand growth between now and 2040. And along with that, we are seeing a rising impact of plastics not only on wildlife, not only on human health and the environment, but on the climate. And this is because greenhouse gases are emitted at each and every stage of the plastic's life cycle. Those impacts begin upstream with the production of the oil, gas, and coal from which plastics are made. We see methane leakage and flaring from wellheads and pipeline systems. We see the fossil fuel combustion and the energy consumption in the drilling processes themselves, land clearance to make way for pipelines. Farther downstream, plastics refining is among the most greenhouse gas intensive industries in the entire manufacturing sector, and it's the fastest growing. This is important because it is also a highly emitting process, not only because it is profoundly energy intensive, but also because the processes themselves emit greenhouse gases at every stage. Sorry, I just had something froze my presentation. Okay. Even after plastics are produced and used, however, their impact on the climate continues. We're seeing this with incredible growth in emissions from waste incineration, often under the guise of waste to energy. As plastic is being burned to get rid of it, the climate impacts from those emissions are continuing to accelerate. When you combine those impacts, the net effects are staggering. In 2019, CL prepared a conservative estimate of those impacts. What we found was that in 2019 alone, the impacts from the life cycle impacts of plastics were equivalent to 189 coal-fired power plants. By 2030, we projected that those emissions would rise to the equivalent of 295 coal-fired power plants, rising to 615 coal-fired power plants by 2050. And it's really important to recognize that these emissions are cumulative. They add up in the atmosphere. And that means between now and 2050, the plastics life cycle could add 56 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere. This is equivalent to 13 or more % of the Earth's entire remaining carbon budget in a 1.5 degree world. But as I emphasized, our estimates were conservative, and the real picture continues to accelerate. In October 2021, Beyond Plastics and Material Research released a new study building on ours and looking specifically at the US that found in the United States alone, the emissions from plastics in 2020 were equivalent to 116 coal-fired power plants. They projected, moreover, that by 2030, plastic emissions from the plastic industry will exceed the emissions from coal in the United States. One consequence of this is that we cannot address the climate impacts of plastics without recognizing that those emissions are arising from across the life cycle. And this is why in the United States and in Europe, you see a growing number of calls to keep the fossil fuels in the ground that are fueling that life cycle and driving the plastics crisis. But I want to close by noting an even more insidious and potentially even more dangerous threat from that life cycle. Plastics do not stop emitting once they leave our homes, once they leave our economy, once they enter the environment. Research has shown that plastics continue to emit greenhouse gases even when they are in the environment, including high impact greenhouse gases like methane. Beyond those direct emissions, however, there are now more than 57 trillion particles of microplastics accumulating in the ocean surface, and that number continues to grow. Research in ocean basins around the world is showing that those microplastics not only affect fish and whales and turtles and birds, they are also affecting the phytoplankton and zooplankton that sit at the basis of marine food chains. This has been documented in the waters off the US Pacific coast. It's been documented in waters off England, in the waters off Kenya, in the waters off China. And this is critically important because those phytoplankton and zooplankton not only form the basis of oceanic food chains, they also provide the mechanism for the global oceanic carbon pump that is responsible for storing vast quantities of CO2 safely in the ocean depths where it can't interact with the atmosphere. In our report in 2019, and again in a publication with Heinrich Boll, we cautioned that there was a growing risk that microplastics could interfere with that oceanic carbon pump with potentially catastrophic impacts on the climate. In 2020, the first scientific research came out that began to document and affirm those warnings, noting that while there was still research to be done, potential microplastic pollution, the potential impacts of microplastic pollution on phytoplankton sequestration could have really significant impacts on ocean carbon sequestration and should be of deep global concern. This morning, a new study came out in environmental pollution that builds on those findings and finds that growing pollution from microplastics in the ocean could potentially lead to a reduction in carbon export from the ocean surface by subtracting phytoplankton assemblages, which means reducing the abundance of phytoplankton in the ocean, with negative effects on ocean productivity. And this shutdown could lead to a significant accumulation of additional carbon in the atmosphere. Put more succinctly, what this evidence is showing is that the plastic crisis could be accelerating the climate crisis, not only by contributing to and accelerating the emissions themselves, but by impairing the Earth's ability to store and sequester potentially enormous amounts of carbon. And with that, I will pause.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we're going to now take the mic and hand it over to Alice to tell us your story, sobering story about the petrochemical industry in China.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. So I'm going to be talking a bit about something that I would call lock-in on the level of carbon, but also on the level of toxicity and the level of tremendous political and economic obstacles to addressing these problems that have already been so well laid out by Carol. I mean, I think one thing it's a premise, I don't have it entirely, I guess, evidenced, but the premise of this presentation is that actually, although this connection between plastics and climate has been signaled for years, thanks to the work of SEAL and Break Free from Plastic and so many other organizations, actually this connection is less in the public eye, you could say, in China. And the reason for that, I think, is due to the tremendous scale and intensity of these issues, of the greenhouse gas emissions alone, and of the toxic pollution and hazards as well, like major accidents that occur. And so what I want to share with you is some of the reason why I think this might be the case and could be something to work towards about thinking about solutions. So yeah, the petrochemical industry is obviously one of the biggest in terms of, or it is the world's biggest globally in terms of energy demand. But in China, just to put that in perspective, it accounts for 6% of energy demand, which is the size of a country, as a speaker noted in this forum on China's painful transition from coal. So that's the equivalent of Germany and on parallel to steel China is also unique in the petrochemical sector by being the only country to make petrochemicals from coal directly, which is almost sort of counterintuitive from an efficiency and economic perspective, but due to a drive for self-sufficiency, because China also accounts for, and I think this shouldn't be underestimated, a major aspect of the demand drive for all these new petrochemical plants that are being built worldwide. And yeah, obviously a lot of China's energy is still coming from coal. So that compounds the issues when we're not just talking about oil and gas, but the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. This is an image from some research that we did in Nanjing, just showing the coal power plant behind the petrochemical transport company, and the corporate sustainability slogan, create real safety, care for employee life. So where I'm coming from, I've just finished a large project for the European Research Council on environmental justice and the global petrochemical industry. And this is focused primarily on issues around toxic pollution, debates about the health impacts, but it has widened throughout the climate crisis, the plastics crisis, and all these compounding crises. And so I think looking through the supply chain issues and the debates, there's been a lot of overlap in our research. And yeah, looking at the three major producers, China, the US, and Europe. Our research in China focused on on places where there haven't been like major protests that have been in the news, like the anti-PX protests that have been so widely covered, but more on bases where there have been very large petrochemical areas. And what I'll talk about today is our research in Nanjing. And so what we did was more qualitative, sociological, doing visits and talking with people, workers, migrants, villagers, and NGOs. I can't really do justice to it today, but it's just a flavor. So just a little bit of background about the petrochemical industry in China. Furthermore, I think what's distinctive about China beyond what I've already mentioned is that it's dominated by state-owned enterprises. And that, yeah, China since the 2000s has become like the largest petrochemical producer globally, despite still not being self-sufficient entirely. So it's still buying petrochemicals. And I think for those of you who haven't already made the connection, like another word for petrochemical companies is a plastics producer. They're producing the resins that are made into plastics. And a lot of focus has been on this particular type of petrochemical called paraxylene, or PX, which has been very much a symbol around protests and struggles. And in addition to these issues, there, as I've mentioned, there are also issues related to the compounding of or the clustering of petrochemical industries right next to other polluting industries, which makes them more risky. And we've seen a number of very deadly major disasters recently, which have also given pause to Chinese authorities in terms of cracking down on some of the problems around safety. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of Nanjing as a city, it's a mega city on the Yangtze River. But it's got an unusual geography in that it's encircled by 4 very large heavy chemical industry clusters. It's got hills in 3 directions and water in 1 direction. So actually the local government has for years actually realized this is quite a huge risk because they could be trapped in the event of one of these major disasters. So what they've done is they've tried to move a lot of the small and medium-sized enterprises into a park in the north, and you can see on the map that's on the north side of the river. The problem, though, is that on the one hand, that also agglomerates risk in a particular area, given they're all together, and they've also not been successful in moving the large state-owned enterprises in other parts due to locked-in infrastructure, but also kind of geopolitical issues there. So this is I won't tell you which one, but this is one of the fence line communities. So one of the places where there's an adjacent community very close by to a petrochemical plant in Nanjing, and that's the slogan on the stadium, healthy work, happy life. And this is from the field notes of a project researcher there in 2016, talking about petroleum coke and coal loaded and unloaded, gigantic cranes and a coal chemical plant that I was mentioning before. So that you can see all of these are all together agglomerated, and actually people didn't really distinguish between the petrochemical industry and other industries like coal in terms of where the hazards were coming from, fertilizers as well. And what was quite interesting, I guess, on the ground and sobering as well, is that basically there was very widespread knowledge locally among the workers, among the residents, that of all the health risks associated with spills, with breathing all the horrible dust, with the fact that basically it is bad for them there. There are many complaints which they thought were underreported in terms of health effects like nasaitis, or nose issues, cancers, headaches, low mood. There's widespread recognition among people that companies secretly discharge their waste at night, and that they just close their windows to sort of get rid of the bad smells. Yet, as in many countries, and this is similar in other petrochemical areas, there's dependency on these plants for work, and an increasing shift where the most privileged workers, those on the highest salaries, live further away from the plants, and the migrants live closer to the plants and also don't work in the more dangerous jobs. And there was a very strong sense of frustration on the ground. Like there is this environmental protection hotline, but there's this overwhelming sense of like, there's nothing they can do about it. And in this context, certain compensations are offered to local people, but in very limited ways. So things like early retirement for people who work in these toxic jobs, or organizing rehabilitation retreats for like a week away to rest away from the bad air. There have been a few settlements, but very low scale settlements for people whose land has been poisoned or who have dead fish in their ponds. But when we spoke to people, they said most of those had already been settled. And some companies also provided free water to communities due to contamination issues. And there were locals, even some expressed gratefulness for that as a sort of sense of what companies were doing for them. And I think it's important to note, I can't go into this in detail, but how migrant workers are completely excluded from any rights to compensations because they don't live there. So there was this kind of, I mean, this is just quite striking in comparison to some of the US examples where everybody knows about the health risks, they're not contested, but there's no access to information, there's no scientific reports. The pollution is acknowledged by the state, but they don't make that information available. They don't say it's an occupational health risk explicitly. It's normalized, it's part of everyday life. And even the NGOs are working in this context where they're trying to improve the environmental monitoring, trying to work within the sensitivities around the political systems in pragmatic ways to help reduce risk. But they're not thinking about the bigger issues about linking to climate, linking to environmental justice. That's just not within the realms of possibility. So just, yeah, to conclude, there's this petrochemical lock-in that's occurring across these multiple sites and scales. And this does resonate not just in China, but in different fence-line communities we've looked at around the world. But in the case of China, it's particularly intense in terms of I guess the problems on the ground. And yeah, there's many political obstacles that need to be addressed. And I think, I guess one interesting point is that the accidents and the toxic pollution are actually maybe more immediate for local concerns, but also are something that could help mobilize concerns at the higher levels for addressing this. So it's, yeah, really just this dilemma of what pathways forward, how could we think about combining the priorities of decarbonization with thinking about these other issues of toxic pollution, and also these debates that I don't think are happening there either with regard to just transitions for protecting workers and communities through transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. Yeah, that last issue, I know that in the Q&A I want to talk about the kind of the ripple effect, because we know that in China they're pulling coal, trying to lower coal in the power sector, and this is a new market for it. So yeah, we'll dive into that in the Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, starting to get some questions coming in. Do want to, Dr. Summer-Gerald Sandler, could you give me more detail on your question so I can understand it better for in the Q&A? But yeah, encourage other people to ask more questions. And how about we bounce over to Manila now? Thank you, Yvonne. It looks great. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm Global Coordinator for Breakthrough from Plastic. And what sets Breakthrough from Plastic as a global movement, apart from other formations out there, is that our members work on this issue across the entire value chain of plastics, from extraction all the way to disposal. And I think Carol's presentation clearly already established the connections between plastic pollution and climate change. And so I will not dwell further on that, but rather approach this from the issue of how, from the perspective of how our members are battling some of the narratives that are being pushed out there when it comes to plastic pollution. And one such narrative, of course, one of the impetus for which projected the issue of plastic pollution into, let's say, a climate of opinion out there, was the fact that pollution was clearly showing up in the oceans. So this is a marine plastic pollution issue, but at the same time, we know that plastic pollution is another visible outcome of the wastefulness of the petrochemical and the fossil fuel industry. And there was a study in 2015 which identified these countries as being the top sources of marine plastic pollution. The issue, however, sorry, what happened there? Sorry about this. The issue, however, is that it ignores, this narrative ignores some basic facts, presumably because of the extensive coastlines associated with these countries and the rivers that flow from these countries into the oceans, that they've been identified as top sources. However, the study has been misused to present a different picture. For one, that the problem of plastic pollution globally is due to the irresponsible behavior of consumers or citizens in these countries. That's one narrative that we've heard. The other being that this is the fault of governments in these countries because they do not have the proper waste management infrastructure to deal with the problem. This ignores the fact that since the advent of commercial plastics production in the 1950s, less than 10% of all plastics produced has actually ever been recycled, right? And the great majority of plastics have ended up as pollution in landfills or burned in incinerators or left in the open environment and also in the oceans. And the fact that even industrialized countries like the US and in Europe, they've been grappling with this issue of plastic for years, except that they were able to hide it off. And one way they've done that was by exporting what they used to call recyclables or recycling to China for decades, right? Until China, I think 3 years ago, decided to say no and put a stop to importation of plastic waste. But the result has been a mad scramble for alternative destinations for the plastic waste coming from the West. And Breakthrough from Plastic members in Asia Pacific have exposed the problem and this mad scramble for alternative destinations for the waste. We've exposed the conditions, the transformation of once pristine communities into dump sites overnight, right? And we've used that to try to convince the Basel Convention to adopt an amendment to allow prior informed consent for plastic waste being sent to their shores from the US and other OECD countries. That's one way that we've been trying to battle that narrative. The other thing that is missed when you talk about, top sources of plastic pollution is really you're ignoring the some of the key drivers behind the manufacture and approaching this from the demand side of the question. The manufacture of single-use throwaway plastics, like for example the sachets, which are made from multi-layered material. They're non-recyclable. They're difficult to collect, and they're single-serve, single-use. And if you go to Asia, come to an Asian city, you'll see our markets flooded with sachets, and mostly deployed by multinational companies, also national companies, wanting to capture local markets, particularly the poorer sectors of society. But they know that there is no viable way to actually collect and dispose of this material. They're non-recyclable, and nobody bothers to collect them. And in fact, if we look at industry growth projections, a lot of it is really going to packaging for Asia in particular, and now expanding to Africa and Latin America, which is why in Breakthrough from Plastic, we've pioneered what we call brand audits. It's really taking the usual cleanup activities to the next level. And for 4 years now, we've been doing brand audits. The latest one we've done a few months ago, and participated in by thousands of volunteers from different countries. And the idea of the brand audit is really to document not just the kinds of waste, but also the brands, that we typically find in cleanup operations around the world. And here you'll find, for example, the usual top polluters led by Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Unilever, Nestle. These are the usual suspects, often dominating our top polluter charts. And the difference with this year's approach is we tried to connect this with the climate. As Caro said, every stage of the plastics value chain, there are greenhouse gas emissions, and we tried to equate the climate footprint with also the plastic pollution footprint of these companies. Now, through these approaches, exposing waste trade, doing brand audits, we are slowly trying to evolve or change the narrative around really what's driving this crisis. So it's not simply the countries that have been named, but really looking at companies and manufacturers that are liable for this problem. It could be a mix of global as well as local companies, such as this set for the Philippines, for example. The industry response so far has been dismal. I mean, they've responded in typical fashion with false solutions, talking about recycling despite the 70-year track record of failure. They've been talking about recycling for ages, and now coming up with new technologies like chemical recycling, untested, not yet proven to work at scale. For example, Coke, our top polluters, keep talking about recycling, keep putting out pledges to improve recycling, and constantly failing those pledges every time, right? And yet this is still the industry response to the problem. So what we've done in Breakthrough is we've tried to take this work to a higher level by really examining the kind of responses that not only fast-moving consumer goods companies are adopting, but also industry associations like the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and other, formations pretending or trying to come up with approaches to deal with the problem. And what we found is that a great majority of the documented approaches by industry unfortunately fall under what we call false solutions, whether they're unproven scale technology like chemical recycling, or they use or we can say exploit labor, cheap labor to collect disposables, and then at the same time send them off to an incinerator or a cement kiln, or they engage either in cleanups, which we consider a false narrative, or announcing initiatives or breakthroughs, but then nothing really comes out of it. And 85% of all these initiatives we consider false solutions. Only a very less than 15% what we consider truly reuse-based alternatives. This is an example of a false solution. Now, using the concept of plastic neutrality, I suppose, in line with also net zero language that was very popular, the recent COP. So Nestle, for example, claims that they have already reached plastic neutrality in the Philippines. And how they do this is they work with informal waste sector and local governments. They collect as much plastic packaging as they put on the market, according to them. But then what happens to the waste that's collected? It's burned in cement kilns, right? And as we know, burning creates toxic ash, air pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. We know that as a sector, cement industry is probably one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and plastics also. If it were a country, it would be the fifth largest source of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So combining cement and plastics really is a terrible idea. And meanwhile, there's no reduction in plastic packaging. In fact, industry is investing billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in expansion. And we've seen that from Carol's presentation and from Alice's presentation as well, expansion in the US and also in the Middle East and China for petrochemical facilities. And the decarbonization trajectory for energy and transport, unfortunately, means that they are going to be putting their eggs on plastics, and that would be a disaster for the climate. And finally, just wanted to say that our approach in Asia Pacific and also elsewhere is really to transform that linear economic model that has brought us to the brink of this climate disaster and also waste crisis, and moving that into a circular model. And many of our members in the Asian region particularly have been doing this type of approach where we do promote recycling, bottles, paper, for example, metal, and even some plastics, and also combining that with composting for organic waste. But the important intervention really is the stuff that cannot be recycled, cannot be composted. And this is where policy initiatives calling for product redesign or ban on single-use non-recyclable plastics like sachets, and where EPR laws are needed. Because at the end of the day, what we want to see is really a shift in investments and focus on alternative delivery systems. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. A good solution focus. Go further upstream to not even get it into the whole pipeline. Thank you so much, Fan. A lot of questions. Questions are coming in. Thank you. Keep going, people, with those questions. And Rosa, you're going to close us out here. Tell us about your fascinating work, also very solutions oriented. And we can see your PowerPoint perfectly.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to introduce Client Earth and the plastics team at Client Earth very quickly because there's a lot to talk about. So Client Earth is an environmental law NGO. This means that we advocate for laws that better protect nature and people, for robust enforcement mechanisms and access to justice, so that these laws are properly enforced and so that people are empowered to act to protect the environment. And we also bring legal cases to hold governments and companies to account for harming the environment or for failing to protect the environment. And as you can see from this map, we work mainly from offices in Europe, but we do also have an office in China now, as well as an office in the US. And our work isn't limited to the regions where we have offices either. So we sometimes work on matters and cases in other parts of the world too. And we work on lots of different topics, including air pollution, climate change, forests and wildlife, chemicals and plastics. I'm a lawyer in the plastics team, just one of two people. So currently our work is limited to the Europe region, but I'm going to tell you a bit about what we've been doing in Europe, and hopefully that might give you some ideas or food for thought for other regions that you're working in. So before I dive into talking about how we make the links between climate and plastic production and consumption in our work, I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we've been doing on European laws on plastics and packaging and waste, because this takes up a huge amount of our time. The European Commission, as far back as 2014, started work on reforming packaging and waste laws, and this has taken the form of revision of certain key sort of keystone laws on plastic packaging and waste, as well as an entirely new law, the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which was quite groundbreaking, and you might have heard about it. And in contributing to the reform and revision and drafting of these laws and new laws, we work very closely with the European policy arm of Break Free from Plastic, which is called the Rethink Plastic Alliance. And we've really closely followed the processes of drafting these new laws and really pushing for maximum ambition and the most effective laws possible. Not always successfully in everything that we've asked for, but I think broadly speaking, with some good impact. And there are lots of kind of different components to this package of laws. The first example being the landfill directive, which broadly speaking is intended to reduce the amount of waste being sent to landfill. And then there's the packaging and packaging waste directive, which relates to design requirements, seeking more standardized packaging across the EU, obviously to facilitate waste management, facilitate recycling, and also potentially drive down demand for packaging. And then the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which takes the plastic items most commonly found on EU beaches and it groups them and then introduces a series of measures on them. Some of these plastic items are just banned outright, and others extended producer responsibility obligations are introduced for them, which means that the company that places these items on the market, that's selling these items or supplying them, has to pay the costs associated with waste management, which can be lots of different types of costs: litter collection and transport, and even awareness raising measures. And finally, there are also some labeling requirements as well. So if you've been lucky enough to visit Paris recently, you might have seen on some coffee cups, disposable coffee cups, this little label on the left-hand side. So really this work involves harnessing the technical expertise of NGOs that work on these issues to figure out what will work, what might the unforeseen consequences be. So of course, for example, for the landfill directive, of course, we want to disincentivize landfill, but how can we do this in a way that doesn't encourage investment in incineration? And obviously this work doesn't just involve the laws itself, it's very, very ongoing. So there's lots of secondary legislation which contains guidance on the application of the laws, defines key terms and establishes methodologies. So really the work that just keeps kind of rolling on, and some of the secondary legislation is super important to how well these laws function. An example would be the definition of plastic. Might seem like it wouldn't be a very contentious topic, but that absolutely hasn't been the case. For example, you wouldn't want companies and brands to start using materials that aren't technically plastics but have either similar effects on the environment or are indistinguishable from plastics, and so disrupting waste management systems. Now I am going to move on to talk a bit more about how we integrate climate into our work on plastics. So really taking the information that you've just heard from the other speakers and building that into our legal arguments. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a case that we have currently running against Ineos, which is one of the world's largest petrochemicals companies. And this case relates to Ineos's plans to expand its existing petrochemicals facilities in the port of Antwerp in Belgium by adding an ethane cracker. So this is an installation that would take ethane as a raw material and crack it to create ethylene, which is the raw material for some plastics and is used a lot for plastic packaging. Under EU law, companies that wish to carry out projects like this, they need to apply for a permit. And in order to obtain that permit, they have to conduct an environmental impact assessment. So that's an assessment of the impacts that the construction of the project will have on the environment and the project itself once it's completed. So in this case, the impacts of the installation itself on the environment. And what we've done is we've challenged Ineos's environmental impact assessment that it completed itself. And we've said that it has not properly described and covered the environmental impact that this project would have. And obviously that's with the objective that Ineos is denied the permit and the project would not go ahead, and there's not an additional cracker in the port of Antwerp generating more single-use plastic. So broadly speaking, our climate arguments for the case were that Ineos had failed to adequately take into account Scope 3 emissions of the project in its environmental impact assessment. So we included evidence relating to emissions associated with the extraction, processing and transport of shale gas, which is the raw material for the ethane which would be put into the cracker, and methane emissions as well, arising from the shale gas extraction. And then of course, emissions associated with these giant tankers called dragon ships, absolutely huge tankers that are used to export the ethane from the US to Europe. And obviously arguments relating to the fact that ultimately the ethylene generated from the plant, much of it will end up being incinerated, and when that happens, the carbon locked up in those plastics is emitted into the atmosphere. So exactly the arguments that you heard from Carol at the beginning. The challenge is ongoing, and we're still waiting to see the results, but we have had some successes to date. And then we have another very different work stream, which is what we call plastics as a business risk. And this is really trying to make the case to companies, and perhaps even more so to the investors in those companies and to the banks that finance those companies, the businesses that depend on single-use plastics, like, for example, the big food and beverage companies and grocery retailing groups, that they face mounting financial risks arising from their dependence on single-use plastics. And these are linked to a very rapidly changing regulatory environment, mounting consumer pressure, of course, and the reputational risk of being a company that's publicly associated and renowned for contributing to plastic pollution. In September of this year, we published a report setting out these risks in detail. And in the report, we really emphasize that these risks don't just relate to plastic waste and plastic pollution, which are probably the most widely recognized and well understood manifestations of the plastic crisis, but also from the links between plastics and climate. So for example, we talk about EU regulatory conditions, which to date have shielded plastic producers from the carbon price, and these are starting to be phased out. And obviously fossil fuel markets are facing very, very uncertain market conditions. And we make the argument that plastic packaging is likely increasingly to embed the carbon price and to therefore represent an increased cost for these big users of plastic packaging. And finally, we are using similar arguments in legal challenges that are based on corporate law to challenge companies with a large plastic footprint. So specifically, we're talking about laws that require companies to disclose information about the impacts that they have on the environment. Just a few weeks ago, we filed a complaint against Dutch international supermarket group Ahold Delhaize, which is one of the world's largest supermarket groups. And we said that it had breached laws requiring it to publicly disclose information by failing to provide information to the standard required on plastic packaging. And we made sure to include arguments that Ahold Delhaize had failed to disclose information on the impact its use of plastics had on climate change and the financial risks that it faced related to this. So obviously this complaint, just like our report, just like the work on Ineos, they're not just about the effects on climate of plastic production and plastic consumption, but at every point we're trying to integrate those arguments into our work on these topics, because we really want companies, investors, financial institutions, and governments and decision makers as well to recognize that single-use plastics is really a piece of the fossil fuel infrastructure, and that it doesn't make any sense to have robust policies and laws are tough on fossil fuels, but remain silent and inactive on single-use plastics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, that you're the cases you're talking about, like you're trying to grab onto the, suing them, the Ineos case was amazing. The whole life cycle of their plastic and how its climate footprint. I mean, that seems like this is a groundbreaking kind of case. All right, I'm going to go to some of the questions. I have some of my own, but first the one that from Dr. Sandler. It's a quick, easy one. I think that maybe Carol can ask it, because you talked about the microplastics, and Dr. Sandler wanted to know, do microplastics in the ocean end up into the food chains that humans are consuming? And
they absolutely do, and that's not limited to microplastics in the oceans. We are seeing microplastics accumulate in freshwater supplies, in freshwater species. They've been documented in numerous species of commercially harvested fish and shellfish, including in the edible parts of those fish and shellfish. Microplastics have been documented in drinking water, both from municipal water supplies and in bottled water in places globally. Microplastics have also been documented not only in agricultural soils, but they've been documented to be taken up into the edible parts of food crops. And as a result of this, microplastics have been documented in stool samples, in human stool samples, from researchers literally around the world. And so we are consuming microplastics on an ongoing basis in countries around the world. It's really important to note that there are both direct physical impacts of these exposures, which remain poorly understood, but even more importantly, microplastics are an important vector for other chemical toxins. They both include toxins that can leach out of the plastics, and toxins adhere to the plastics in the environment and then can be consumed in that way. So it is a poorly understood but potentially enormous source of those exposures.
Okay, sobering stuff. We've actually at the China Environment Forum, one of my, Dr. Karen Mansell from Ohio State University, she's been publishing with us and has more stuff coming out about in China and the US about plastic mulch that degrades, gets into the soil. I mean, China's #1 in terms of plastic mulch. You could cover the state of Nebraska with it, evidently, according to our back of the envelope calculation. So, but again, that's another sector that, I mean, none of you mentioned earlier, that agricultural production, there's a lot of leakage there as well, and getting even closer to our food. Okay, let me toss a couple questions out. I'll do a couple. One that goes directly to Vaughn. Vaughn, this is from Ted Lung, who's a fellow at the Wilson Center. Would Vaughn consider the US Plastic Pact, we talked about at a meeting earlier, to be one of the false solutions promoted by industry? Just hold on to that one. And then there was another question that from Allegair, department chair professor at George Mason University. It said, Vaughn, I think he means, do you see that when the business giants are committing over 15 billion over 5 years, this program that was launched in 19 to minimize and manage plastic waste, and 80 partners, including chemical, plastic manufacturers, and he gives a list. I mean, I guess he wants to, do you see some kind of promise in those? I mean, if industry is trying to make this commitment, I mean, maybe how, because you said there were a lot of false solutions, but the money's going out, and I was kind of wondering maybe how can that be shifted to be better? Because I mean, there is some effort being made, but you guys have all kind of talked about that it's very complicated. We'll start with those two. Oh, and then we'll start with that one. Vaughn, can you answer those two? And then I've got more coming in. They're flying into my widget here.
Yeah, on the plastic packs, because we have come across some of these packs being put together in some countries in Africa, and then I think also in Southeast Asia. I mean, the concept of multi-stakeholder participation and shared approach to the problem, nothing wrong with that, except that the dominant solutions being propounded under these packs include the usual waste management approach, either investing in waste to energy facilities or even chemical recycling. And we've seen this type of approaches being pushed heavily by industry participants in the plastic packs, right? So I think this is where also civil society voices are important, to try to balance out those voices, and also push for approaches that put more premium on reuse based alternatives or zero waste approaches to the problem. The problem when we did that report about where industry is investing their
Maybe there's a question that I got from Helen Vanderhort, Wealth of Flows Consulting, about what about single-use plastic alternatives to plastic food service packaging? Because it's a big question, like because a lot of we've seen more of these kind of paper products that have lined with plastics, and the question is asking about are there any good performing truly non-plastic single-use plastics out there for food delivery? What do you say, Vaughn? Is anyone working on these?
Well, that's the thing, because right now, when you look at industry innovation, they're either looking at alternative feedstocks, so looking at alternative material, and some of them regrettable substitutes, because you still don't know what the consequences are of, let's say, scaling up the use of this alternative material. So it's not also about replacing plastic with paper, right? The key here is really to choose between disposable versus reusable, and it's a systems change that we're talking about, and not material substitution mainly. So yeah, so I would consider this type of approaches of tinkering at the edges instead of really approaching core of the problem, addressing production, reducing production, and really scaling up reuse-based alternative systems.
Okay, great. I want to, because I'm the China Environment Forum Director, I want to ask Alice. So that was very sobering work that you did. When did you conduct that work? Pre-COVID?
Between 2016 and 2018, with some updates subsequently remotely.
And well, I mean, what comes to mind is that, we know that, China, they've had this big war on pollution, right? Started back in 2014, air pollution, water pollution. And I mean, so from what you're saying, it almost seems like that the petrochemical industry, that they're just still, they haven't come under the iron grasp of the Chinese government to regulate. I mean, do you see any hope or any openings where they may be better regulated?
Well, certainly in the context of these explosions, there have been tighter regulations and kind of crackdowns, and part of the shift to these industry parks is about trying to create safer places which are further away from communities. But I think the problem is actually the same as it is in the US and globally, which is there is no recognition anywhere that we should scale back petrochemical production. And it's still seen as a growth mechanism, and in the Chinese state, it's a pillar, and it's meant to be, a drive towards, they use this language of self-sufficiency around, being able to produce all their energy, but also their own plastic commodities. So I think it's evading attention due to more attention going to more obviously polluting sectors that are right next door, like coal and steel, even though petrochemicals are just as bad. And I think just drawing it back into the wider conversation, I mean, I was at the COP26. It was very disappointing, but petrochemicals and plastics were very low in visibility there, and that's partly because fossil fuel companies weren't technically allowed to be there as like kind of showcasing, even though they were there anyway. And so there were all these discussions about difficult to decarbonize sectors like heavy industry, like steel and aluminum and like the big and transport. But there weren't those conversations about petrochemicals and plastics. And so as long as we have this model where there's this imagined idea that we can, keep producing more plastics as a lifeline for oil, coal, and gas, then that is the problem. That's not recognized in China, but it's not recognized in Europe or in the EU either, because it's still, about having your cake and eating it too, basically.
Well, if Rosa has her way, it's going to be recognized more sooner in Europe. But okay, Rosa, I'll get you a specific, you're going to be pulled in here now too. But first, with what you just mentioned, so Keith Lawrence at the Pew Charitable Trusts and a few others have also mentioned this question. Okay, the climate impacts of plastics aren't getting the attention they deserve. I think he was probably also at the COP at 26. So he said, what can we do to change that? And so there were some other people who've asked the question in my widget that, what about a global plastic pact? I mean, there's been some conversation. Carol, where are we? I've heard talk of global plastic agreements.
So in February, the United Nations Environment Assembly will convene in Nairobi to look at this question specifically. And to date, more than 140 nations have actually come out in support of the idea of negotiating a new treaty focusing on plastics. So that momentum, that support for an agreement to address the plastics crisis is there. I think one of the critical distinctions is between countries like countries that are, following the industry line that treaty should focus on recycling and plastic in the oceans and plastic as a waste and cleanup issue, versus the growing number of countries who are saying we can only address the plastics crisis by addressing the full life cycle of crisis of plastics. And I think that's what we'll see in Nairobi is, where is the momentum, where is the energy to really address this problem comprehensively. And I think there is growing support in civil society for doing precisely that.
Rosa, what do you think about, kind of drawing on the kind of work that you're doing, because I mean, yes, we're starting to have a global agreement, but I was really struck with, how you talked, you're concerned about environmental justice issues. I mean, as is Alice, and that this is also about a just transition. We hear that talked more about with the energy sector. Where I mean, do you think that is your work? Do you think that you're going to help your organization and others similar kind of help get that on the map, on the agenda to get into even the global agreement that Carol was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. So we're trying in our work to integrate so many different issues associated with plastics. And I found it really interesting to listen to Alice's presentation, because the kind of health impacts both of plastic production and of plastic use is something that's increasingly interesting us from a legal perspective, from a liability perspective for companies. I think I have this sense that despite not very limited public comment from the brands and from the supermarkets on the issue of plastics and health, that increasingly it's a topic of concern for them. And from my view, in terms of what we're seeing happen with consumer protection laws that are better able to protect consumers in Europe, which are kind of on the agenda now, that it's going to become challenging for companies that use a lot of single-use plastics, that they're going to be increasingly the sort of a lot of the chemicals used in plastics are going to become more heavily restricted. So I think this really comes to the fore when we try and communicate with financial actors and with investors, because we're trying to give this kind of panorama of the situation with single-use plastics, and really incorporating all of these different problems. And when you look at the kind of global supply chain, because it's just because, as one said, those slides with the countries from which the largest amounts of plastic flow into the ocean that's really misleading, because that's not necessarily the origin of that plastic. That's not necessarily the reasons why it's there. And a lot of these companies that are headquartered in Europe and elsewhere are really contributing to those problems. So it's trying to pull together that comprehensive picture and present it to people who perhaps have more influence on changing company behavior than we might do as NGOs on our own.
And you're focusing mainly on Europe, but I wonder if you and some of the other panelists think that can the work that Client Earth is doing, can this get traction in Asia or US?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that would be the hope. And I think as our team expands, that's definitely, we realize that that in a sense, the focus on Europe is not necessarily justified, in that many of the communities that are really facing the human rights abuses associated with plastic production aren't necessarily in Europe. So the extent to which our strategies would be replicable in perhaps like an Asian context is I'm sure there'd have to be some kind of adjustment, but that's something that we've seen traditionally and historically from our work as Client Earth, that each kind of legal context requires different tools and different strategies, but sometimes the same ideas and the same approaches can work when they're adjusted. So I think that's definitely something we'd want to do, because, you know, carving up the planet in terms of geographies for this kind of problem doesn't make any sense, just like carving up the supply chain doesn't make sense.
Because the supply chain is global, obviously. Vaughn, do you have something? What do you think about the Rosa's approach? Well, it's not just Rosa, it's her organization. Because I mean, the EU it's given Client Earth a really good legal foundation already, because they've led the world on EPR issues, et cetera. What do you think about I'm asking, it's a rude question, and then you can jump into, Alice, about Asia, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. The work that's happening in the EU and the work being done by members like Client Earth, they open new avenues for our work in other regions. The EU Plastics Directive is cited as a model, and many countries are following suit as well. Ironically, when you talk of, you know, aid agencies from Europe, they've been using their same directive also to promote this circular economy approach for Asian economies. However, in that kind of promotion, they're basically focusing on incineration or waste to energy facilities, which sorts of, you know, double standard, because that is not how circular economy is defined in the EU. So definitely we use the work being done by our members in Europe to try to you know, neutralize and really attack these double standards.
And Carol, you just messaged me. You said, you said you could talk about more about this on the US and Philippines, and then to you, Alice, after him.
Yeah, first to begin with the Philippines. In fact, Oceania Philippines, working together with Philippine citizens, filed a writ of kalakasan against the Philippines government, focused on the climate and human health and human rights impacts of plastics in the Philippines just last month. In the US, we are seeing growing interest in litigation strategies focused on plastics, beginning with false claims of recyclability, false claims of compostability. But as Rosa mentioned, I think what you're likely to see is people looking to the model of climate litigation that have been, you know, that has been accelerated in countries around the world, and looking really carefully at what are the corollaries to that in the plastics context. There are slightly, you know, there are important differences, but there are really important commonalities as well.
Great. Alice, do you have anything you want to add to this with China? I mean, China does have public interest lawsuits on environmental issues.
Yeah, I think one issue, I guess, to bear in mind is about how knowledge, expertise, and debates about rights and justice travel. And I think there is a little bit of a risk with regard to the idea of kind of maybe transposing expertise, even if it comes from a good place, in a country like China. I mean, I think it's great that there's NGO work and you know, obviously those connections, but I think a lot of those solutions need to be owned by, you know, NGOs working in China. And I mean, there are so many great examples of ones that have emerged from the grassroots, like the cancer villages research with IPE, And so I think there are some strengths there around the kind of work that's being done on quite a pragmatic level with regard to tackling a whole range of different kinds of issues, that's starting from where I guess China is at. So I think that's part of the learning curve with regard to, thinking about I know solutions, and Rosa alluded to that as well, is you need to be sensitive to local contexts, to different political players. So that's, that would be my view.
Well, also just one point, we just had him on recently, Ma Jun from the Institute from IPE, where he is doing, he on his map is his app, they're tracking, like they're helping cities in terms of tracking plastic waste and, trying to make sure that obviously the sorting and collection goes well. But he's done in the past, he works with multinational corporations. He's got, gone after, I don't want to say go after, but really kind of crashed open transparency around coal, like coal's water footprint and pollution from the IT and other industries. So, and the government, this kind of information is useful because they're, the Chinese government is concerned about pollution, but yeah, this is going to be a tough nut to crack, I think, in any country. Someone else want to jump in on that last question, or can I can, well, here's one that's, well, we have another couple of minutes. Here's a small one, back to the question about that Dr. Sandler had about the microplastics, saying that microplastics in food and stool do not demonstrate that they were absorbed across the intestines. What is the evidence that microparticles are in human organs and cause consequences? Do we know that yet? I can insert that I do know that there's a lot of research happening on this, trying to understand it. But what about Carol? Anyone else? Maybe Carol, did you have any other insights into, are we feeling confident that there is an impact?
Yeah, I would say that the research in this space is in its early stages and continuing to accelerate. CL released a report on these specific issues in 2019 on plastics and health. I'd encourage people to look at that report. It's quite comprehensive in discussing the exposure pathways. We do know, for example, that plastics can cross the blood-brain barrier in fish. We've seen evidence of plastics in human placentas. There is evidence that certain sizes of plastics can cross through intestinal walls. With respect to the impacts of that, I think it's important to understand that it is actually profoundly difficult to quantify the amounts of plastics in the human bloodstream, and it's also very difficult to know what chemicals those plastics are transporting with them, largely because the companies producing the plastics are profoundly secretive about the contents of the plastics and the chemical adjuvants that are produced during the production processes. So all is a way of saying that it's clear the plastics are there. There's growing evidence that it can move across critical biological membranes. There's growing evidence that it's showing up in the human body in extraordinary ways and pervasive ways. And we know far too little about what the impacts of that are, given how pervasive the exposures are.
Okay, so we went from microplastics. Let's go to the big macro issues. Kelsa Schumacher from the U.S. Institute of Standards and Technology makes the comment that how do we get like a real target if we're concerned about plastics climate footprint? What would this target look like? Is this, how do we come together on the agreement? And maybe that's a whole other panel discussion. But I would say that question from Kelsa is like, and this is my question to all of you, like what are some of the tricky things that we need to figure out on the plastic climate linkage? And I think for me, that would be like one of them. Like, how do we even start setting the standard? I'd like to do a quick round robin to close this out. You can either comment on that comment or tell me, what do you think? What are some things that you guys are going to be working on to keep propelling forward this awareness and action on the climate plastic linkage? Rosa? You nodded more, so I went to you first.
Yeah. So that's definitely a question that we've asked ourselves a lot, that, we're working with, I suppose, an undefined planetary boundary on plastics, and that does create difficulties for us. Sometimes we talk about the fact that if we had Paris Agreement targets for plastics, what kind of challenges would that present to our work, but also how would that make our work easier? So it's something that we're definitely discussing, perhaps more at a philosophical level at this point, but I think a technical challenge definitely that will be grappled with.
How about Vaughn? What's your wish list? What are we going to solve next?
Aside from shifting resources and subsidies to the real solutions, I think it's absolutely essential that plastic production is capped. It's ironic that, while industry keeps harping on recycling as a solution, they're undermining that very solution by producing even more plastics, because, recycling cannot compete with virgin plastic. So that and if there's going to be a global agreement on plastics, it absolutely has to be one of the essential points that need to be considered.
My dog is heartily supporting your comment there with his barking. How about you, Alice? What do you see, like maybe focusing in on China, what kind of steps or changes do you think could be, help us get to the plastic climate linkage in China? Or beyond, because you did do US and Europe.
Well, I mean, in answer to your question, I think a mandated phase down on a global level of plastic and petrochemical production is what we need. Similar to a global agreement that fossil fuels are causing the climate emergency, we need to recognize that. And then if that's actually recognized, then action could follow, including in China.
And there's a lot of things, okay, a lot of organizations, and their real action could be propelled this forward. Carol, you were the circle will be complete. We come back to you at the very last comment.
The first, foremost, and clearest target is that we need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC has said that to do that, we need to cut global emissions roughly in half by 2030. If we know that plastic production is not aligned with that, then the key is to figure out what the plastic sector needs to do to align with that, beginning with stopping expansion. And then, as Alice and Vaughn said, accelerating the phase down, starting with the single-use disposable plastics, which are by definition, the most wasteful, least necessary form of plastics.
All right. Well, you guys, this is like a great discussion. I love the audience. You gave me great questions. I couldn't even get to all of that. Well, I tried to get almost all of them. I'll follow up with them afterwards with some of the speakers to get more answers. But thank you so much for all the great insights you gave us today. And yeah, carry on with your great work. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and keep an eye. If you're interested, go to our website to sign up for our mailing list. We're going to keep doing more work on plastic and also the plastic and climate. Going to also have in January a meeting on plastic and food, or food and climate, sorry. And there'll be plastic interwoven in that as well. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good morning and evening everywhere. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.